Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. A very warm welcome to you all. I'm Peter Maher, Director of Alumni Relations. Coming from Wits, from school to Wits in the apartheid years was an eye-opening, life-changing experience, offering the opportunity, perhaps for the first time in our lives, to express and show opposition to apartheid. Our audience tonight ranges from extremely distinguished alumni who played a significant role in opposing apartheid as student leaders and in their subsequent careers, as well as to average students like myself who took part in demonstrations and protests and remember them vividly, although they seem a lifetime away now. This film is dedicated to all those who participated in these protests and to Dr. David Webster. Dr. Lieza Louw made this documentary between 2010 and 2017 and focused on a crucial 30-year period from 1957 to 1987. Today, we will be screening a 30-minute version of the original hour-long documentary. Thereafter, we will be joined by a panel for a 30-minute discussion of any comments or questions posted by the audience or to make observations on their own. And I'm really keen for people to, as they're watching this documentary, welcome to use the chat to make comments and observations, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. Our distinguished panelists have extensive resumes that I can't do full justice to here, so let me apologize for the brevity in advance. The panelists are Dr. Lieza Louw, a professional filmmaker and a research associate at the Wits School of Arts. Her professional work includes documentary films, environmental and educational programs, and corporate work for Wits and the Cradle of Humankind. Lieza's films have been screened at local and international festivals. Professor Themba Maseko is head of the Wits School of Governance. His distinguished career includes being a former Director General in the Departments of Public Work and Public Service and Administration. He was CEO of Government Communications and Information System and a cabinet spokesperson. He's a chairperson of Corruption Watch, a member of the Council for the Advancement for the South African Constitution, and a trustee at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. He is also the author of For My Country, Why I Blew the Whistle on Zuma and the Guptas. Themba was president of the Black Student Society in 1986 and 1987, and a member of the South African National Students Congress and the Azanian Students Organization. Emeritus Professor Yunus Ballim was the head of the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering from 2001 to 2005. From 2006 to 2012, he served as the Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic and as Vice Principal at Wits. He then served a 6-year term as the founding Vice Chancellor of Sol Plaatje University in Kimberley. Yunus served on the Council on Higher Education and was chair of the Higher Education Quality Committee, and presently chairs the Council of Umalusi and is a member of the board of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Yunus was a member of the Black Student Society in the late 70s, and we'll hear more from him in the documentary. And lastly, Dr. Mark Orkin, who can take credit for the title of this documentary, Like Shooting Sardines in a Barrel. Mark was SRC president at Wits in 1968 and 69. Following study abroad at Oxford and Sussex, he lectured in philosophy and sociology back at Wits before founding CASE, an anti-apartheid social research NGO in 1985. Mark was a part-time professor in the Faculty of Management until being appointed to head Statistics South Africa, and in 1995, he subsequently headed the Human Sciences Research Council. With that concludes the introductions. Before we start, I know you aren't the safe space generation, but let me give you a trigger warning alert and say some scenes are distressing. But I do hope you enjoy the documentary.
Wits, it's always been at the bridge of being political, global, national, white, black. It's the interlocutor between communities in ways that very few institutions are. I think the real reason it's politicized because it has no other option but to be politicized. It is in Johannesburg. The fact that Johannesburg was the center of the mining industry, the fact that Johannesburg was the largest contributor of any city to African growth, that's what made Wits. The fact that black people came and settled in Johannesburg, whether you liked it or not, and that Nelson Mandela was knocking on this door, whether Wits liked it or not. And that feeds on into even the contemporary era. We don't debate and theorize the politics, we're forced to confront the politics.
And so it was a 40-year-long struggle that we kept going. It is a pity that sometimes the story has been forgotten.
It was a very liberal campus, you know, we all felt strongly about discrimination and so on. The university was certainly, eventually took lots of action against the laws which were passed when the apartheid government came in.
The open years became closed years. But all the same, you know, I think that Wits was such a free society. It was an ocean of freedom, you know, in what was desert around. And the more exciting times were the times when there were meetings of the Student Representative Council and the Students' Medical Council, at which many hot political issues were discussed. They were packed meetings, they were exciting meetings.
There were interesting times, there were fiery meetings in the Great Hall and on the steps and even the amphitheater. There were speeches made, both against the government and its policies and the authorities of the university.
Came 1957, and the government started telling the universities, this is the legislation we are proposing. And we took a great protest from the steps of the Great Hall right through the streets of Johannesburg. We marched without noise or agitation, just one big poster in front. Assembled on the steps of the City Hall, we were addressed by the senior representative of the Senate, who was Professor I.D. Macrone, afterwards the Vice-Chancellor. And he gave a wonderful address urging us to fight against the sacrifice of our academic freedom.
So we have this illusion, often in the public discourse, that had 59 not happened, Wits would have been black. Nonsensical. Wits would have remained white. But what it did allow Wits to raise is it gave Wits the liberal credentials that he needed. to consolidate itself, to stand up against it. And it stood up against it by saying, you don't have the authority to tell us who to include or not include in our institution. And those liberal credentials on their own were important because it attracted a particular layer of students. And those liberal credentials were used by successive generations of students, whether white or black, to broaden the space to struggle for a much more radical agenda.
There was an incredible kind of environment at Wits which was entirely open to questioning, to protesting, to making one's views evident. And Wits was known as the hotbed, one of the hotbeds, of kind of political resistance to the nationalist government. But there was, of course, always a conservative element. And there were moles everywhere.
Students were always spilling out into Johannesburg, and Johannesburg was always interacting with the campus. So it was a lot of the young progressives were on campus. We would meet during the day and make plans to go out pamphleting or knocking on doors, all the things that you had to do then in the days before television, in the days before people had high walls and intercoms. Politicians came and spoke on campus, and that was interesting.
It was mounting dismay, the ever-increasing powers taken by the Minister of Police to lock people up without trial and to subvert all the normal democratic processes of the law.
Protest meetings were all very ritualized in those days. There was a format. And the format then was that you would march around campus, getting more and more angry, and then you would march to the Braamfontein barrier between Wits and Braamfontein itself, shout and scream, and the police would then arrive, and there would be a standoff. And then the really brave students would cross the barrier and inevitably get arrested. And that happened every time. So that was the protest mode. I think once or twice we actually marched through Braamfontein, or we stood with placards outside in Jan Smuts Avenue, which was considered by white students, perhaps because they were quite protected people, it was considered extremely brave.
The very acts, the very consolidation of the law generated the very opposition to the law, and it became the rationale for student struggles. In the early 60s, it smashed the resistance, frankly. And so yes, you had Rivonia, you had all of the opposition to Rivonia, all of that kind of stuff. But resistance at a mass level was smashed. Reignites towards the late 60s with the emergence of the Black Consciousness movement, and then takes on an added impetus in the 1970s with the trade union movement, and then Soweto 76.
Banning was a terrible thing. Banning left you with nothing. You couldn't work because you couldn't work with other people. You couldn't go and see other people. You couldn't socialize. It was really soul destroying.
There was the orderly protest, the academic protest, then there was what one might describe as the disorderly form of protest, and that was the demonstration. And the demonstration became a regular feature of Wits' life.
We'd walk through Braamfontein, a lot of students, I mean hundreds and hundreds. And the police would keep a sort of a polite distance. There are many jumbled images that I have of that. You know, I remember being outside John Forster Square, and at a certain moment something happened and we all just ran.
Because the ANC had been banned and the SACP, we didn't have an older generation, particularly being white, who could give you the line or introduce you into political culture or orient you politically or induct you or help you to grow politically. We had to find out things for ourselves because we were completely cut off from an older generation of activists. Many who had left the country, were in prison and whatever.
Do I think that in the 60s, the lack of leadership was debilitating? Yes. Do I think that in the 70s it was debilitating? No. I think in the 70s it generated its own leaders. In fact, leaders more appropriate to the time. Steve Biko, for instance.
And then I think black consciousness really exploded that whole radical white world and in a way destroyed it. The kind of perhaps rather comfortable world that white lefties were in was very much disrupted.
And many of those young activists of the late 1960s, white activists, were forced by black consciousness, were asked to ask hard existential questions of themselves. And many of them went on to become radicals in the trade union movement that played a fundamental role in eroding the apartheid state.
When you saw how a mass uprising could basically be butchered into nothing, then you started to realize that you needed to do some fundamental thinking about our political strategies.
It was my 18th birthday, and we sat in the Great Hall and listened to all kinds of reports, and people were being killed. Places were being set alight. And this was a sign of things to happen, you know. People are standing up now. And we had our student leaders, we had the SRC, and a number of quite left-leaning guys on the SRC who were prepared to lead. And I think that's what helped little students like me to be able to get involved. Then we had a mass meeting at lunchtime in the Great Hall, which was again very rousing, and you know, we must stand in solidarity with the Soweto students. Don't be silent, don't sit down, and we headed off into town again. And we marched in quite an organized group, very tight group, to Queen Elizabeth Bridge. Then the police, they then stopped us, and then they just attacked, and we scattered in all directions. And then one of the guys grabbed me and beat me with his baton and pulled me up to a police van, and then about 20 of us were at the police van, and we were called veilgoed and all sorts of stuff. That was an interesting day, 17 June, 76.
Gave an interview some years ago, and I said, partly inexplicable, John Forster's obsession with smashing student protest. I said it was a bit like shooting sardines in a barrel.
Wits was a frightening experience. My first year was quite frightening. To remember, there were only 25 black students in the whole Faculty of Engineering in that year, 1977. The other big group was in medical school. I think together we made up about, it must have been 120 students on this campus, black students.
Although it was very elitist and largely white at the time, it was one of the few places that there was some modicum of racial integration among peers rather than the master-servant sense. And more particularly, a lot of the issues off campus, the township issues, the socio-political upheavals were reflected on campus as well. So we had huge debates, a lot of very vehement discussions and some very perhaps even unpleasant incidents. But that was really where Wits then was where South Africa would soon be.
In the future, the University of the Witwatersrand accepts the responsibility to provide tertiary education for South Africans. By that I mean South Africans of all races.
Some of the best things that Wits ever did were quite alien to what universities would normally do. Our neighbouring universities and in the country, the universities that were controlled by the government would expel students who had a political activist background. And Wits used to transgress the mutual agreement that exists between universities that a student that is expelled does not gain access to higher education elsewhere. In fact, we became the haven for those political activists.
I was expelled at Forte. I was a student leader at Forte. I came to Wits and I joined the Black Student Society. Throughout my high school life and my primary school life, I went to schools where there were black people. So for me, it was like seeing the sea for the first time. So many white people, and amongst them there were those who supported the anti-apartheid struggle.
The Black Student Society existed on campus at that time. Of course, we joined. We were members. The Black Student Society then was a very strongly black consciousness movement. Quite strict in its application in that regard.
That if you are in Soweto, you come to Wits to study here, you leave Soweto being surrounded by the army and the police. You can't say, you know, you're going to study freely from those kind of pressures and concerns. So we then became active in community issues, but also transferring those issues to campuses. So we would address student issues, but at the back of our mind, we realized that, you know, student issues on their own would not be able to bring about the kind of freedom we wanted. We therefore had to couple them with broader political issues that affected our society.
Of course, at the same time, we had a policy of non-participation, which we basically said that the black students in the liberal campuses are there as guests. But ironically, you know, it's guests of the apartheid government because you've got to get ministerial consent. So that is an emotional crisis if you think about it. But tactically, we had a strategic alliance with NUSAS that during election time for NUSAS presidency, we would assess and vote for NUSAS. So our colleagues in the black consciousness leanings were sometimes would actually give us a bit of a rough time. But tactically would then see the merits of saying, let's vote, you know, progressive elements, progressive comrades in there, even though we wouldn't see eye to eye. But we also somehow felt guilty in a sense that we were in these ivory towers, somewhat cushioned from, you know, the death squads in the township.
Black Student Society became an SRC of black students. Black students here inclusive of colored Indian and African students. And we found that it was much more easier for us to be heard when we were operating as a bloc. As a bloc, even though we were in a minority, but if we could actually influence the developments both on campus and nationally by organizing separately, we felt that it was a good strategy to use. So separate organization was actually our strategy, but never a principle.
I remember one time when we disrupted a UNITA gathering, speakers from Angola representing UNITA, and we just went and made noise until the time was up. And Professor Shia, who was one of the more sympathetic professors, was really angry, and someone sat up to the 11th floor, and we had a debate there which lasted something like 4 hours before this was resolved. And this was the spirit of any difference that was there. It could be resolved around the table.
If there was going to be a student march on any particular day, I'd wake up and think, oh, hell, how am I going to get through this day?
Hand the memorandum to the senior officer in charge.
They were tough days.
Please here, then you are the person.
He always played a mediating role between the students and the police, but when the police shot him, we all got very angry against the police, and we just went for the police. 1,000 students were arrested during that day.
Well, it was a very painful moment. As you can see, my screwed up face. So that's what it feels like to be struck by a rubber bullet.
They would march to the periphery of the campus, and there would be waiting large squadrons of police in riot gear who would have tear gas and rubber bullets and dogs, and then there would be, a conflict in which, depending on a particular day, there would be almost always a firing of rubber bullets and then a firing of tear gas, and then the police would come onto campus and they would baton charge and arrest people that they caught.
I remember the first time the cops came on campus, and it was a very strange thing because we were in a kind of a closed environment.
Every one of you.
It's a foreign environment for me. What do you do when you have people chasing you with guns and dogs? In those days, there was the crowd disposal method, and then ultimately tear gas.
It was perpetual upheaval, perpetual crises, perpetual mad things being done by the government. And a period where I think you felt it was more tragedy than hopeful. Nobody felt that there was any optimism, any end that could come out of all of this that would be productive. So it was a very sad period.
The period was a period of intense political activity, intense political challenge, huge action. The fact that cops were on the campus was a period of the state of emergency, where people were being arrested, where there was ferment right across the nation and in the institutions. And so I was very much part of that movement and of that climate and of that period.
Anti-apartheid leaders were placed continually under surveillance, and so the police would come to people's homes at various times of the night and day and arrest and detain people. And then those people who were most unlucky were disappeared and killed. And there were a number of students where that happened, principally black students.
I remember this well because we had got ourselves organised into cohorts of about 50, and we were going to go out and give ourselves up to be detained. Me and some of my friends really decided we're going to be courageous this time. We're going to push it as far as we can go, and we were prepared to be detained. We were prepared to actually go into jail if need be for a night or two, which is how we saw it. The first cohort went out, offering themselves up for detention. And instead of that, they laid into them brutally with quirts and batons. Some people really very, very seriously battered. and suddenly we thought, hang on, that's not what we had planned.
It was also a period of intense political contestation within the black community. It's often forgotten. This was the period where the ANC and the Black Consciousness Movement fought for hegemony. There was the huge challenges around whether Mandela would be released. There were townships were in flames.
But now we felt for the first time we had an opportunity to get as many people as we could on our side. We started this thing called the United Front, which was now we were meeting with all student organizations, a South African Jewish Students Organization, Muslim Students Organization, all the societies on campus. Met with them, strategized together. Guys, what is important is for us to show unity against apartheid. We got every person. It was one of the biggest marches I've seen on campus.
I remember protests also around the quota system for black student admission, where F.W. de Klerk, I remember, was the object of that protest. That resulted in a coordinated effort between the university establishment and the students.
These chairs were still out because of the meeting that had been held, and so the students set the chairs there to tell them what they thought of them.
For those of us involved in the anti-apartheid, in the leadership of the anti-apartheid movement, was sort of something that on the one hand gave us comfort, but also placed us under a sense of obligation to resist the system as much as we could.
Students all over the world, and you can pile up the examples, often are the leading agents of change. They might not be able to effect that change, but the first signs of change to come emerge from students.
Wits has been at the forefront of political events for the last 60, 70, 80 years. It is the place that produced Nelson Mandela and where Robert Sobukwe sat. It is the place that produced some of the leading Marxist intellectuals, Harold Volpe and others. It is the place that produces, if you like, Gwede Mantashe, Helen Ziller, Musi Maimane, and probably 3/4 of the EFF leadership.
Me?
Okay, you're back. You're back.
I'm back. So I'm sure that stirred up some memories and, of course, some emotions. I don't see any comments posted yet, so I'm going to jump into Lieza Louw and ask her, Lieza, tell us a bit about what motivated you to make this documentary and your experience of making it. And you're on mute. It looks like you don't have sound. Okay, well, while Lieza maybe... Yeah, we can hear you now, Lieza.
Okay, fabulous. I was an undergrad student at UCT in the early 1970s when all the New SAS leaders were banned, and Jeff Budlander was our SRC president. And so, you know, we also just ran when the police came. I joined Wits as a filmmaker and then as an academic, and I was reminded of these events. And, you know, nobody has told these stories. So I started doing the research, and we put out calls for people to participate, to be interviewed. I think I collected something like 80 hours of material. The biggest problem was that was money. Peter really helped a lot. And obviously the Department of Film and Television also contributed by making spaces available, equipment available, and also helping with the transcriptions. So yeah, this is sort of what has been in my blood. Peter, I hope that answers your question. But I also think it was a really interesting exercise because for so many of the people that I interviewed, it was the first time that they could tell their stories. And there was a lot of tears, but obviously we didn't want to include that in the film because that would have been somewhat unfair to the people.
Thanks, Lieza. And I can see comments coming in, I think, and clearly people want this documentary to be made available much more widely, which we will do. So we'll speak a bit about that later. I want to jump to Themba because Themba's the only person here in our panel who hasn't seen this documentary before. And so I'm curious what you thought of it, Themba, and what your experience was as a Black Student Society president at the time.
Wow, Peter, colleagues and friends, I was actually blown away when I saw this because I've always been thinking that we actually have a history that's not captured anywhere. And I've been toying around with the idea of getting together and just, you know, coming up with a book to capture that history, especially during my time. So I thought it was really spot on. And it brought obviously great memories. I mean, a lot of the protests that the documentary depicts, I was really in it. So I thought it was a great documentary. The second point is, I mean, I'm actually shocked that you said, Peter, that the documentary has been around for more than 10 years. I've never heard of it, never seen it. And it's something that even my generation of people who were part of a lot of those activities would not have been aware of this. So I think that that's one conversation we need to have. And then lastly, just briefly, Lieza, it's not a criticism on you, but I just thought the issue of projecting the unity throughout the generations is something that I think if we were to do another one, we might have to just, you know, put that very strongly, because I thought that during my time as a student here and a student leader, one of the things that came across quite strongly was just the unity among students, academics, and one thing that I saw as missing was just highlighting also the contribution of the admin staff, the workers, we became part of a lot of these struggles. They may not have had a voice, but I think that they were part of that unity that emerged during our period. And a small point was that working with the workers here, that actually gave rise to what we know today as NEHAU, which became a national union. But its origin could be traced back to the kind of close working relationship that we had with all the stakeholders in the university system. Yeah, so that was one thing that was actually quite I'm missing in the documentary, because I think that it would be important to demonstrate that, you know, in achieving the unity, we had all sectors or stakeholders in the university who were saying the university cannot be an ivory tower and keep silent when trouble was happening outside the walls of the campuses and of the campus. And almost all stakeholders were actually able to come up very strongly. So it wasn't just NUSAS, it wasn't just the SRC, it wasn't just the Black Student Society or AZASO, but there are quite a number of other student organizations, maybe smaller, but who actually played a role. I mean, Yunus may remember there was something called the Muslim Student Association. Yeah, there were other associations that actually played a key role. So I think that's one thing that I would add. But finally, I think that this needs to be captured in a book, and I think this has revived my interest in thinking about, you know, capturing this in a book. But
Thanks,
excellent.
Themba.
Thank you.
Well, I look forward to reading the book. Lieza, I don't know if you want to respond very briefly.
Yes, I do want to. Prof, there's a 60-minute version. So this was made later for Peter to screen for students. And I think more information is definitely in the film. And I also just want to mention that Dr. Orkin, when I interviewed him, and he said, if you don't stop now, you're going to be busy with this until you walk with crutches or something to that effect. So yes, there was a kind of limit on what I did.
Great work.
So Mark, I saw that your name is mentioned here. Someone Mark Orkin was SRC president when I was in first year. It's Marissa Rolnick. I saw quite a few images of SRCs in the documentary, and a whole bunch of them happened to be spies. What is your views, Mark?
Excuse me. Well, spies is perhaps yet another discussion. Somebody mentioned Craig Williamson, who really was known during his latter student career to be a spy. I remember the then NUSAS president attempting to warn people of that fact, and nevertheless, he was able to firstly betaking himself to Geneva, where he funded some people who came back to do underground activities, and of course were followed by the police. Their networks were picked up, and they in turn were arrested. And Craig Williamson's activities didn't stop at that spying and information. People will recall that Jenny Curtis had gone into exile and with her child was killed by a parcel bomb sent to Botswana. That would have been in the 70s. So spying was not always just information, but it is also worth recalling more broadly. I think there was an SRC executive in the mid-70s, and it was discovered that 3 of the 6 were spies for different agencies. And somebody would be able to find out when that was.
So I see Caroline makes an interesting point here. The secret police used to walk around campus in brick red or lime green safari suits with matching socks. Later, they learned to disguise themselves, but initially they were very obvious.
Mm. Yeah. I wonder if I could just intrude a factual point. In thinking a bit ahead to this evening, I asked ChatGPT, I must admit, what were Black students' enrollments from before 1959 and the legislated closure of Wits until roughly the present. And ChatGPT was defeated by the lack of coherent available data about Wits. But this fascinating point for me emerged that in 1959, the year of the segregation and that huge banner, Blacks, broadly speaking, were about 300 students in the nearly 5,000 students at Wits. So as Adam Habib said, even before segregation was imposed, class factors, among others, bad schooling, kept Wits very largely white. African Blacks were 74 in those 300. So when I took office as SOC president in 68, there were 4 African Black students on campus.
I see someone has also made the comment about the outing of spies. And one of the other dangers of putting spies in a student body is the paranoia that it creates, the suspicion that it creates around some students who could actually be innocent as well. So there's also, you know, what you could call collateral damage done by these spies. Yunus, Themba mentioned the Muslim Student Society, and you were in the Black Student Society. Can you tell us a bit about the role they played?
Yeah, I was. Thank you, Peter. I was never a member of the Muslim Students Association. It was the Muslim Students Association, but they did sort of later on, and the time that Themba was referring to, align themselves with a sort of a united front at that time. And if I may refer to just in continuation of the earlier discussion on the subject of spies. Of course, there was a student organization called the Students Moderate Alliance. Themba, you'll remember them. SMA, they were called. Yeah. They, in fact, there was no concern about whether you would be outed incorrectly or anything. They were quite openly on the payroll, and they gave information. In fact, the brief time that I spent at John Foster Square, the fellow who was questioning me was not very careful, and he left his notes on the desk, and I recognized some of the names of the people who had reported to provide a basis for which I was arrested. So yeah, it became quite open and obvious. They were very fancy. They certainly didn't wear safari suits with matching socks. They were registered students, and they provided information. So that was quite open. I think I wanted to pick up also the point that Themba was making, and that is the general support that we got from informal structures at university was important. I remember when your money was really down, you could always get a good meal, a wholesome meal at the workers' canteen, which is behind Hillman Building, which is where I am now in civil engineering. And workers sort of were sensitive. We used to take a third-class train to get back to township every day, every morning and every afternoon. And some of the Wits workers took the train with us as well. And even though you were always standing on the train because there was never a seat, but there were workers who looked out for us. And it really was a time, it was affirming, it was supportive, but it wasn't always the formal structures in the university. And then the point that Belinda makes, which was the time felt like tragedy. And it was actually a sad time. And you got a sense that that this apartheid edifice was so formidable it was not going to move. And I guess that's the value of watching Lieza's movie, is to say that it doesn't matter how formidable that edifice appears, that with continuous picking away in the small ways that lots of students, lots of people at Wits and at other institutions, in townships, at homes, we actually ate away at that edifice. And today, we don't, the Nationalist Party doesn't even exist anymore. And apartheid, we remember it with sadness, but we say we're really pleased to live in a country where we don't have to have anybody subjected to that kind of brutish behavior. So that for me is the other value of Lieza's movie. It's just to remind us of what good, sensible political action can do. Even though there was disagreement, and Tim will remember that as well. We had I was most offended at the idea that we would vote in the SRC elections. I grew up in Kliptown, where the Black Consciousness movement was we schooled in that. Pumville was my political ground, and so those debates were severe. They were strong, but outside of campus, people supported each other. There was probably not a black township around Johannesburg where I couldn't find a plate of food and a bed to sleep, even if politically we didn't get along. And so, yeah, it really was an interesting time. And then to Mark's point, I want to remind us that the first black PhD in mathematics was Joseph Mokoena at Wits University. I think his PhD was in 1959, which was just about the year when the act was passed. But that was the very first black PhD in mathematics, pure mathematics. Yeah. So no,
this
it's
was
been
in
a
the
long
country,
history.
Yunus, in the
Sorry?
country, not just at Wits.
No, in the
PhD.
country. The first black PhD, Indian, African, or colored, or Chinese. Well, I'm not sure about Chinese, but certainly Indian, African, colored. Mokoena would later go on to after passing through US, Ghana, ended up teaching mathematics in Zambia, where he died in an accident. Yeah. But yeah, those were, Wits, small as the numbers were, there was some sort of remarkable outcomes. Yeah. Thank you.
I'd just like to add a point that students were also interestingly active with lesser or greater long-term impact beyond the university and beyond protests. So Lieza's starting date is in fact before 1959. And of course came 1960 in Sharpeville, and the ANC went underground. And at that time, the NUSAS leadership felt that it needed to join the underground activity. And the first president at the time, after 60, was Adrian Leftwich, and he was followed by John T. Driver. And they were in due course arrested, I think following the bombing of some railway cables in Cape Town. And there was, of course, a big controversy because John T. Driver had known everyone who might have been in ARM around the country and yielded that information to the police, which was something that tortured his conscience for the rest of his life when he became an academic at York. But differently, people who had been in the underground from NUSAS reconciled with him. And John T. Driver had to, after detention, go into exile. And then different outreach was, of course, NUSAS' international connections and the huge impact when the NUSAS president at the time, I think that would have been Ian Robertson, in about 1966, invited Robert Kennedy to South Africa, who accepted and spoke at all the campuses. And one of his most famous speeches, which I think is on his memorial, was about, how did he put it, the ripples of protest that would add up into a tidal wave. And I think that's part of the story, but another part, as with the African resistance movement people, small, clandestine, and finally with negligible impact. But 69, when Wits was almost, as I showed you, entirely white, my vice president, Neville Curtis, became NUSAS president. And what he did was encourage students to start attending the wages commissions in the early 70s. And from those activities, the beginning of white ex-student involvement in organizing unions, especially some mass activity in Durban, was a very important indication of how protest in itself can move beyond itself and help enable the real motor forces of change in society. Now, of course, a unionist has told me that support was waning by 1976, but the government blew that all up with its attempted legislation of teaching in Afrikaans. The Soweto revolt took off and went national with like wildfire and with huge courage and great cost. And that in turn revivified both the student movement inside the country and the renascent ANC abroad, partly because many of the students came out of the country and wanted to join MK, or the black students wanted to join the PAC counterpart, which was less prominent. And all of that then laid the groundwork for the beginnings of the Free Mandela campaign in 1980. So student activity in reaching beyond the campus has had a kind of rolling influence in the development of the wider forces of change, which really did finally bring down the end of apartheid. And of course, students abroad as well, with our state of emergency, consciousness of South Africa was alerted. And this sanctions campaign really took off with American students on the campuses demanding that they disinvest their pension funds from South Africa. Now that was serious money. And simultaneously, there was pressure on Swiss banks from this global anti-South African tumult, which had really become prominent, not to roll over their banks. And I think that those forces of rising disinvestment and sanctions, plus, of course, other trade union involvement, students still in jail, really brought a ruling regime to realize that P.W. Botha, who was handily ill and had to step down, had to be replaced by the possibility of negotiation.
Thanks, Mark. So I see from someone's commented a pivotal moment at Wits was the visit by Senator Robert Kennedy. And that was in 1966. I see there's a question about that. We actually have a documentary on that as well, which we can screen. It's RFK in the Land of Apartheid, and it's done by Witsi Larry Shaw, based in New York. So we'll try and show that as well. I saw a lot of comments about the whole matter of spies, and clearly that is a whole complex issue. Maybe it merits a book on its own. I just want to move on to a question about to what extent was there coordination or national coordination between Wits protests and demonstrations and, for example, UCT? Did NUSAS help coordinate those?
Well, certainly harking back to the nearly all-white situation still, 1968 was, of course, a year of ferment abroad. It was protest against the war in Vietnam. It was a near successful popular revolution in Paris. And that vibe carried through into South Africa and was picked up by radical students left of the SRC in Cape Town, who arranged the first sit-in, to my knowledge, at South African universities. And they chose a very clever issue, which was demanding that the libraries stay open in the evening so that students could study. Now, that was, of course, an irreproachable issue with which to force the hand of the Senate and the Council. And we up at Wits were very taken by that activity. But from our side, we perhaps noticed more it was going to be the 10th anniversary of the closing of the universities. And so we mobilized a series of protests and pavement activity like that. And as Belinda remarked, it was a kind of rolling confrontation with the police and also RAU students. And when I and half a dozen others in an all-night vigil dared to cross Young Smuts Avenue and wave our posters at the rush hour traffic going into town, the police whipped on us with half a dozen vehicles and automatic weapons. I think we were each given our own bakkie to be taken to John Forster Square. And of course, that's a moment of great elation when you bring down the might of the state upon you, but not necessarily one that yet was going to follow international activity.
We're probably running out of time. Yeah. Can I ask if there's closing comments, Yunus? Would you like to make a comment?
Sorry, yeah, I wanted to make a comment, really a comment on the question that you raised, and Themba may also comment on this. I must say, for us as Black students at the time, we had very little association with other universities. There was occasional interaction, but most of our interaction was at community level. Most of our, as Themba mentioned, our organizational background was back in the communities. I remember we ran a homework center back in the township that eventually was closed by the security police because there was so much political activity. But yeah, that was more our connection. I think just as a closing comment, again, thanks to Lieza for this, and what I thought was a really, really interesting and important reminder. I was making the comment earlier that next year is 50 years since 1976. And at Wits, I think the story can be told, retold, revised, lights shone from different directions. To raise that sense of what it means to bring collective political energy into changing the way in which society understands itself, which is fundamentally what a university is there for. But thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Thank you. Themba, anything from you?
Peter, I'll be brief. I think that I want to just deal with the question about the link with other universities and student movements, etc. NUSAS and ourselves, as part of the AZASO, the Black Student Organization, nationally, I mean, we were so involved in making sure that we link what we were doing within the university with what's happening in society, but in other universities. So to the point where the headquarters of NUSAS happened to be, we established them on campus, and even the headquarters of the Black Student Organization has also ended up operating unofficially from Wits itself. So the link, making sure that we run national campaigns did happen. The link with communities was quite central. I mean, when you're talking about the time when there was a state of emergency in the country, when all meetings, political meetings were banned in communities, we made sure that universities, Wits in particular, was a place where banned leaders or leaders who couldn't speak, the Bishop Tutus of the world, the Winnie Mandelas, we brought them on campus because it was some kind of a safe space where we could actually create this kind of platform. We were quite central in the establishment of, as I said earlier on, linking with unions and making sure that NEHAU was established nationally, a major contribution. We're quite central in get involved in setting up civic associations in communities. So activists, members of the student movements were involved. I mean, the fellows you see in the clip, Chris Noble, for example, became a serious community leader in Soweto, leading the establishment of that. So in our mind, it was very clear that what we're doing within the university wasn't just an isolated process. We were part of a broader community, a broader society involved in the struggle to fight against apartheid. But so this video, quite important. The key thing for me is just to take it out of Wits and making sure that society knows, but most importantly, the current generation, students, student leaders, academics at Wits need to understand the role that we played in transforming this society. And I think that we can do some work on that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Themba. And your point is well made, because a lot of the comments were about how can we access this documentary. So what I can say is, one, everybody who RSVP'd to this webinar, we will be sending you the link to the video on YouTube. One of the reasons I haven't immediately made it available on YouTube to everybody is because then I won't be able to have events like this. If I screen it in the Chalsty Stadium here on campus, if I've made it freely available on YouTube, I probably won't get many people maybe coming to my screening. But that is just for the next couple of weeks or months. Thereafter, absolutely, we will make it available. I'll chat to Lieza. I think she's fine with that we make it widely available through YouTube. At the moment, only the 30-minute version is available. We'll try and get the full 60-minute version out there as well. But thank you so much to everyone for your comments. I mean, I've been reading through them. We will certainly be rereading them, taking them into account and see where we can engage further with us. They might form part of Themba's book that he's planning to write. Thank you so much to our panelists. I really appreciate your input for all the recollections. Thank you so much. And we will certainly find a way to make this available more widely, to make it available to students, because I think it would be quite eye-opening to the students of today to see what went down. So thank you so much. And hopefully we'll be in touch soon. Yes, Lieza, last words.
Please, I screened it to third-year students, and recently, as a part of a documentary course, we ran at Film and Television, and they really enjoyed it. But I really think that many of the issues that were raised, not all, but many, were actually addressed in the longer film. So I really, it is a film that we should screen, even if we start at Wits or at the Bioscope, where Witsi is running private cinema, which is fantastic. And also, Peter, we said we would ask everybody who participated if they have material, images, maybe 8mm film, to actually let us know and make it available. The important thing just to remember is that we can use the video for educational purposes, but unfortunately with the limitations on the archival footage, we cannot sort of ask people to pay when they watch it or put it on sort of open streamers.
Okay, you've already got the offer of a music video called Reasonable Men. So please, yes, send your material, send your photographs, pictures, anything you have. They all be very valuable, because absolutely this can be an ongoing project. Someone mentioned the RFK, the Ripple of Hope documentary, and we'll also arrange a screening of that as well. So awesome. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists.